John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, while weep the sons of bondage whom he ventured all to save. But though he sleeps, his life was lost while struggling for the slave. His soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory,
Welcome
glory,
to War of the Rebellion, Stories of the Civil War. I am your host, Leon, and this is a reading of Reminiscences of the 19th Massachusetts Regiment by Captain John G. B. Adams. Chapter 2. Our Journey South. Upon our arrival in Philadelphia, we heard a signal gun, and learned that it was to inform the people connected with the cooper's shop that we were coming. We marched to that place and found a nice breakfast served by the first ladies of the city. This was the only home-like meal we had received since leaving Massachusetts, and our hearts went out to the loyal people, and our thanks were expressed in 3 rousing cheers for them. But we hastened on, and soon took the cars for Washington. At Baltimore we left the cars and marched across the city. We passed through Pitt Street, where the 6th Massachusetts, a few months before, had marked the route with their blood. Every throat was opened as we sang John Brown. But our knees were a little weak, for we expected a stone would strike us at any moment. We found the roof of the depot on the Washington side of the city filled with bullet holes, the result of the riot of April 19th. From Baltimore to Washington, we passed soldiers doing guard duty on the railroad, and for the first time saw men being punished at the guardhouse. We saw one man with his head through a barrel, another carrying a heavy log of wood. At night, we arrived in Washington and were landed at the Soldiers' Rest. A Pennsylvania regiment was ahead of us, so we were obliged to wait until they had been to supper. We marched into the barracks before the tables were reset. The waiters removed the tin dishes, then jumped onto the tables and with dirty brooms began to sweep as they walked along. This was too much for Massachusetts. On the tables not cleared were remnants of the meal left by the Pennsylvanians. Soon the air was filled with bread, pork, and tin dippers. The waiters were unable to stand the attack and retreated in good order. After quiet was restored, our men cleared the tables and the rations were brought in, consisting of moldy soft bread, boiled salt pork, and very poor coffee. Colonel Hinks, being informed of our treatment, found the officer in charge and gave him religious instructions. We received nothing better that night, but the next morning when the 19th marched in to breakfast, our colonel's draft had been honored, and we had a square meal. The Pennsylvania Regiment, occupying the barracks, we had to sleep on the ground. The night was warm, and being very tired we were soon fast asleep. About 4 o'clock we were awakened by something grunting around us, and found that we were in the midst of a drove of hogs. We had never seen hogs running at large at home, and believing someone's swine had escaped from the pen, we concluded to do a neighborly act and catch them. The race began, but with poor success for us, as they could run a mile in 2:40 or less. After our sport, we found an old pump, where we made our morning toilet. We boys did not mind this new mode of living much. We sang, said it was all in the 3 years, and was nothing after you got used to it. Not so with the older men. I remember one instance. Returning from the pump, I saw one of the men leaning against the barracks, the tears streaming down his cheeks. I said, "What is the matter, Peter?" He replied, "I didn't think I was coming out here to be rooted over by the damned hogs." "Oh, I said. "If we get nothing worse than this, I won't complain." "Well," said he, "if we do, I won't stay." He was discharged soon after. After breakfast, we slung knapsacks and marched down Pennsylvania Avenue to our campground on Meridian Hill. We had brought our tents from Massachusetts, and all our camp equipage, including bed sacks, but we could find nothing to fill them with, so we spread them on the ground empty. The ground was filled with gravel stones, and was not as soft as downy pillows are, but so hard that I believe the imprints of these stones are on me yet. At Meridian Hill, we began active drilling. The duties of the field officers were divided. Colonel Hinks taking charge of the battalion drills, Lieutenant Colonel Deverex the manual, while Major Howe had the instruction of the guard. We were encamped on the side of the hill, and marching in battalion drill was very hard. Yet, from early morn till dewy eve, we were executing company or battalion movements. Since our arrival in Washington, all had a fear of being poisoned. We hesitated to buy camp pies of any but old Negro aunties, and a guard was constantly posted with loaded musket over the spring which supplied us with water. One night, a nervous comrade was on duty, and thinking that, in the darkness, he saw someone approaching to poison the spring, discharged his piece. Immediately, the camp was alarmed. Without waiting to fall in line, the cry went up, "Row! Row!" and without muskets all rushed for the spring. The officers cried, "Halt! Halt! Fall in!" But you might as well have undertaken to stop a Dakota blizzard. And not till the men had been to the spring and investigated was order restored. The next day, a square was formed, and a short but impressive address was delivered by Colonel Hinks, which had the desired effect. On Sundays, at this camp, we were marched out by companies, seated in the shade, and the articles of war were read to us by our officers. As I remember them, whatever you did, you were to be shot, or such other punishment as may be inflicted by courts martial. At Meridian Hill, we had our first Sunday morning inspection. The order was for all men to be in line. This included cooks, teamsters, clerks, and all other detailed men. To the regular members of the company, it was a grand sight to see these extra duty men in line. Fowler, the wagoner, had not seen his musket since it was given him at Linfield, and knew nothing of the manual. Neither did Uncle Burrell, who was regimental mail carrier. Lieutenant Colonel Deverex came down the line, and the men threw up their guns for inspection. Fowler had watched the men on his right, and when his turn came, threw his gun up in fair shape. The colonel took it, looked at the musket, then at Fowler. "What do you mean by bringing such a musket for inspection?" "It ought to be all right," said Fowler. "It is brand new, and I have never used it since it was given to me." With a reprimand, the colonel, passing on, soon came to Uncle Burrell, who was not quite as sharp as Fowler, and had not watched the men on his right. When the colonel stood before him, Uncle remained quiet and modestly blushed. The colonel surveyed him from head to foot. "Why don't you bring up your musket?" Uncle took it in his right hand and pushed it toward him. "Don't you know any better than that?" asked the lieutenant colonel. "No," said Uncle B. "I wish that I hadn't come here. I was sure that I should get into trouble if I did." With a smile, the lieutenant colonel passed on, and after that, extra duty men were excused from Sunday morning inspections. Chapter 3. Battles of Ball's Bluff and Edward's Ferry Experiences at Darnestown and Rockville. In a few weeks we broke camp and took up our line of march to the front. Our destination was the Potomac, near Poolesville. It was our first march, and to us tenderfeets, a hard one. The older men of the company laughed at us boys, said we would never be able to march that distance. But before night we left those who had laughed by the roadside. I think our experience, that the boys fresh from school or from indoor life were able to endure more than men of mature years, was general. Just before we arrived at Rockville, Maryland, we received 10 rounds of ball cartridges, and the command was given, "Load at will. Load." I shall never forget the sensation I experienced as my ramrod forced home the first ball. We were told that at Rockville a strong secession sentiment existed, and I expected to kill a rebel or be a dead Yankee before night. We marched through the town and found it as quiet as a New England village. The second night of our march, we arrived at Poolesville. Here we met the 15th Massachusetts, and Company A of the 19th was entertained by Company A of the 15th. Next morning we marched to Camp Benton, which was to be our home for several months. We were brigaded with the 20th Massachusetts, 7th Michigan, 42nd New York, a Tammany regiment, Captain Saunders' company of sharpshooters, and Captain Vaughan's Rhode Island Battery. Our brigade was commanded by General F. W. Lander. The headquarters of the division were at Poolesville, called Corps of Observation, commanded by General C. P. Stone. At Camp Benton, the discipline was brought to the regular Army standard. Drills were almost constant. Each afternoon we were drilled in battalion movements, in heavy marching order, and in every possible way fitted for active service. Dress coats with brass shoulder scales and leather-neck stocks were issued, and when not in line or on guard our spare moments were spent in cleaning brasses. If any men ever earned $13 a month, we did. Besides the camp guard, we mounted what was called Grand Guard, consisting of a detail from each regiment in the brigade posted on the outskirts of the camp, the tour of duty being 24 hours. Often the long roll would beat after we had retired for the night. We would turn out and double-quick to Edward's Ferry, march up the tow path of the canal, lay on our arms the rest of the night, and the next morning march back to camp. At first we expected the rebels were crossing the river, but as we saw no movement in that direction, we looked upon these excursions as part of the drill, the days not being long enough to give us the desired instructions. The enlisted men were not the only ones who had to work, as the line officers came in for their share. Well do I remember, day after day marching to execute the movement, to the rear, by the right flank, past the defile. At last Colonel Hinks became discouraged, and throwing down his sword said, "Let every officer go to his tent, take his tactics and study them, and tomorrow, if anyone fails to understand this movement, there will be a vacancy in this regiment." We came out next day, and in fair shape executed the movement. Many incidents occurred at Camp Benton that are pleasant to recall. We were in a country where there were many slaves, all anxious to serve our officers, and nearly every day some citizen would come into camp hunting for his runaway Negro. One day, a man came to the colonel and was sure one of his Negroes was in our camp. Colonel Hinks sent for Sergeant McGinnis of Company K, and ordered him to assist in the search. By the look the colonel gave McGinnis, it was understood that the slave was not to be found. McGinnis went into the woods with the man. As soon as they were out of sight he halted and cut a switch. "Look here," said McGinnis. "Do you suppose we left Massachusetts and came out here to hunt Negroes?" And to add force to his argument, he touched the old fellow up with the switch. The man was indignant, and said he would report McGinnis to the colonel. "Go ahead, and I will go with you." Both went to the colonel, and the citizen told his story with tears in his eyes. Colonel Hinks turned to McGinnis and said, "Sergeant McGinnis, is this true?" "Colonel, do you think I would be seen doing such a thing?" was the reply. "No," said the colonel. "Sergeant McGinnis is a man of truth, and I must take his word. You have deceived me, sir. Leave this camp, and never enter it again." The man, fearing McGinnis might get another chance at him, left as quickly as possible. Here is another instance of the ready wit of a soldier. We had in Company A an Irishman, who was one day detailed for headquarters guard. The night was dark and rainy, and the morning found Mike pacing his beat in front of the colonel's tent, wet to his skin. Colonel Hinks came out, and Mike said, "Colonel, will you allow me to speak a word with you?" "What is it?" said the colonel. "Well, Colonel, I wish you believed as you did before the war. Then you believed in putting none but Americans on guard, and here I am, an Irishman, wet to the skin, having been on guard all night." The colonel laughed and retired. Colonel Hinks had edited a know-nothing paper whose motto was, "Put none but Americans on guard." Early in October, we were ordered to the river and picketed it from Edward's Ferry to a point above Harrison's Island. By visits of general and field officers we could see that a movement against the enemy was intended. On the 20th, 10 of the best shots of the regiment were selected for some important service. With our officers they crossed to Harrison's Island to reconnoiter. Early the next morning, the regiments began to arrive. 2 small scows were brought to a point opposite the island, and Company A was detailed to ferry the troops across. At first we pushed the boats over with long poles, but as the current being very strong, they drifted down the river, and it was hard to land. After 1 or 2 trips, a rope was obtained from a passing canal boat, and stretched across the river, making transportation much easier. In a short time we heard musketry on the other side, and knew that the battle had begun. The 19th Regiment was the last to cross. As we landed on the island, the sound of the many balls greeted us for the first time. We met 4 men bearing a stretcher, on which was the lifeless form of Colonel Baker, of the 1st California. He was the first man we had seen killed in battle. We were marched across the island, meeting wounded and half-naked men who swam the river. On arriving at the other side, we found there was work for us to do. The only transportation from the island to the Virginia shore was 1 scow. But this, a load could be sent over, then marched up a steep bank called Ball's Bluff. The rebels, being strongly entrenched at the top, could kill or capture our men before another load could land. At last a retreat was ordered as our men were stampeded. They rushed down the hill and into the boat. The little craft being overloaded was soon swamped. Men were swimming the river to escape, and many a poor fellow, not able to swim, went down before our eyes. Others were shot by the rebels, when almost within our lines. At night, those not required at the landing were deployed to the right and left. A drenching rain set in, and without overcoats or blankets we remained shivering until morning. Lieutenant Dodge and 12 men, under a flag of truce, were sent over to bury the dead. Alex, Short, was the volunteer from Company A, and he received injuries from which he never fully recovered. While the flag of truce was out, a rebel horseman was seen pursuing a Union soldier, who was running to the river. A man in Company H on the island fired, and the horseman fell. Immediately the rebels closed in on the burial party and held them as prisoners. It required all the energy and courage that Colonel Hinks possessed to have them released. The next day we picketed the island, cared for the men we had rescued, and on the morning of the 23rd recrossed to the Maryland side, wet, cold, and disheartened. A few shots from our batteries told that Ball's Bluff battle was over. For the number of men engaged, this was the most disastrous battle of the war. No man in his right mind would have sent out such an expedition. There was no way to retreat, and no chance to send reinforcements, except a scow load at a time. The movement was condemned by everyone. It was said that General Stone was a traitor, that signal lights would be placed at a house on the Virginia side, and that he would go down to the river and meet men from the rebel army. The truth we never knew, but General Stone was relieved, and it was late in the war before he was given another command. While we were engaged at the Bluff, Company K crossed at Edwards Ferry with General Lander. They had a sharp skirmish with the rebels, and our brave brigade commander received the wound which resulted in his death soon after. We returned to our old camp, and were soon busy getting ready for winter. About this time, we were called upon to bear our first loss. Not by death, but by the resignation of Captain Stanwood. Lieutenant Merritt was promoted to the vacant position, Second Lieutenant Boyd to First Lieutenant, and Quartermaster Sergeant O.F. Briggs to Second Lieutenant. We were about to undergo our first winter in camp, and had not learned to stockade our tents. We pinned them close to the ground, dug a flue for a fireplace, building a chimney outside topped with a barrel, and had plenty of smoke, but little fire. Neither had we yet learned the art of sleeping in tents. We would put on all our clothes, including overcoats, bring the capes up over our heads, lie down and shiver. Experience soon taught us that to undress and throw our clothing over us was much the better way. On Thanksgiving, the officers of the regiment gave a ball. Men were detailed to build a ballroom, and quite a nice building was the result of their labors. Ladies came from Washington and Baltimore, and a good time was enjoyed. We enlisted men looked on from a distance and thought of the pleasures we had surrendered for a chance to serve our country. After getting snugly fixed for winter, an order came to move, and soon we were on the march for Muddy Branch, to take the place of General Banks' division, which had been ordered to Harper's Ferry. Here, the regiment was assigned various duties. A part of Company A was sent to Rockville. First Sergeant Cook, myself as corporal, and 10 men were ordered to Darnestown. Our quarters at Darnestown were an old barn on the main street, and at Rockville in buildings on the fairground. Our duty at Darnestown was to prevent men coming to town from camp and to allow none to pass towards Washington, below the rank of brigadier general, without proper papers. We had 3 posts, each at a store. The citizens of the town were in sympathy with the South, but as we behaved like gentlemen, they were very kind, often sending us biscuits for breakfast, and at Christmas furnishing a liberal supply of eggnog. We were welcomed at any house, and often, when off duty, spent a pleasant hour by their firesides. Soon after we began duty, Sergeant Cook received a furlough of 30 days, and I was Commander-in-Chief of the Darnestown Army. I had no trouble with the enlisted men. but the officers kicked when I asked them to show their leave of absence. My duty was to inspect the coach when it arrived on its way to Washington, and if any officer or soldier was on board, to ask him to show his pass. I will relate one instance. I opened the coach door one morning and said, "I will see your leave of absence, if you please," to an officer who wore the strap of a major. He growled out, "Call your officer. I don't show my leave of absence to any enlisted men." I replied, "I am the only officer here. I have my orders in writing from headquarters, and I know my duty." He put his head out of the coach window and said, "Driver, go on." I called to the sentry on duty, "If that driver starts, shoot him off the box." The driver did not start, and after swearing a while, the major gave in, but declared he would report me, and he did. In a few days, Major Howe rode up. I turned out the guard and after presenting arms stood at attention. "Corporal, dismiss your guard, I want to see you a moment." Taking me one side, he said, "You have been reported to the headquarters of the regiment." I explained the case to him. He patted me on the shoulder and said, "Corporal, you are right. You are in command of this post, and if the Apostle Paul undertakes to go through this town, unless he wears the uniform of a brigadier general, don't you let him go without showing his pass. And if he refuses, bring him to camp." No corporal in the Union Army felt better than I did that day, and I was glad that the major had reported me. In February, we were relieved by another detail from the regiment and ordered to Rockville. The night before we left, Mrs. Hayes, of one of the first families of the town, gave us an oyster supper, and her daughter, who was a pleasant young lady, but a red-hot Reb, presented me with a rebel flag. 38 years have passed since those days, but I shall never forget the kindness of those Darnestown people, and trust that today they are prosperous and happy. After a time we reported to the company in Rockville, and found the 3 field officers examining the non-commissioned officers. Although we had been acting as non-coms since we left Massachusetts, none had received warrants from the colonel. First Sergeant Cook and I joined the procession. I was never more frightened in my life, as I had never spoken to the colonel, or lieutenant colonel, and the examination was unexpected. The marks were from 1 to 5. In a few days at dress parade, Captain Merritt read the list. He called First Sergeant Adams. I thought he meant my brother Isaac, who had been examined as a sergeant, and I was pleased with his good fortune. When the captain called First Sergeant J.G.B. Adams, and explained to the company that I had passed the best examination and was promoted to that position, I did not want the place. First Sergeant Cook was a good man, and was my friend. I went to the captain, told him I would prefer to be second sergeant, and let First Sergeant Cook remain. The arrangement was made, and I was happy. Our duty at Rockville was very light. The boys had made the acquaintance of many agreeable people there. I was introduced, and the time passed pleasantly. The colored people were holding revival meetings. As we had never witnessed anything of the kind before, we all attended, without regard to religious convictions. The singing was that of wild, melodious nature, that only colored people can render. The clapping of hands and stamping of feet, all in time, cause a thrill of excitement to run through the coldest veins. With the colored people, the effect is such that they are lost to all else but the emotions of the hour. When striving with the spirit, it is a strife in reality. One night they held a meeting of unusual interest, and Company A was represented by a large delegation. Among the number was Uncle Ben Falls. Ben had joined the company just before we left Linfield. He had been a sailor, and his kind heart and ready wit made him a favorite with all. That night, Ben was deeply interested. He joined in the hymn, and although his voice might not accord with the rest, there was no doubt that he sang with the same spirit. Soon the excitement reached its height. Sobs and groans were heard in all parts of the room. Shouts of glory went up from every heart. The spirit took possession of a girl named Melinda, who was owned at the hotel where our officers boarded, and was acquainted with our boys. She shrieked and groaned, and in her striving fell to the floor. The people shouted, "Hold Melinda! O Lord, hold Melinda! The spirit has got Melinda! O Lord, hold her!" But none went near her. This was too much for Ben. He rushed to the front, sat on her, and held her down. This brought Melinda and the rest to their senses, and the meeting soon closed. We enjoyed the pleasures of Rockville, but a short time after our detail joined the company, as we were ordered back to camp, a new company, recruited in Salem and commanded by Captain Deverex, a brother of our lieutenant colonel, had joined the regiment. They were given the letter H, and nicknamed the Lapstone Light Infantry. Old Company H being disbanded, and the men transferred to other companies. March 1st, by order of Colonel Hinks, I assumed the duties of first sergeant, and of all the trying positions I have ever filled, this was the most so. If anyone thinks that the life of an orderly sergeant in active service is an amiable one, let him try it. When the men are not growling about you, the captain is growling at you, and you are constantly between two fires. About 1/3 of the men in Company A had been members of the old battalion, and the town meeting tactics that prevailed in the militia had not quite died out. I was a recruit, and my promotion was not hailed with joy by the old men. It was said by them that they were detailed for guard rainy days. And in other ways I favored the new men. They drew up a petition asking for a change, and some 20 men signed it, and through a committee presented it to Captain Merritt. "What is this?" said the captain. "A petition for a change in first sergeant," was the reply. "Petition? This is mutiny. Go to your quarters, and if I hear more of this, I will have every man court-martialed and sent to dry Tortugas." That settled the youngsters, and I was ever after obeyed and respected.
John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, while weep the sons of bondage whom he ventured all to save. But though he sleeps, his life was lost while struggling for the slave. His soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, for his soul is marching on. John Brown was a hero, undaunted, true and brave, and Kansas knew his valor when he fought her rights to save. And now, though the grass grows green above his grave, his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, for his soul is marching on. captured Harper's Ferry with us 19 men so few, and frightened old Virginia till she trembled through and through. They hung him for a traitor, themselves a traitorous crew, but a soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. For his soul is marching on. John Brown was John the Baptist, of the Christ we are to see. Christ who of the bondman shall the liberator be. And soon throughout the sunny South the slaves shall all be free, for his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, for his soul is marching on. The conflict that he heralded, he looked from heaven to view on the army of the Union with its flag red, white, and blue. And heaven shall sing with anthems o'er the deed they mean to do, for his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. For his soul is marching on. Soldiers of freedom, then strike while strike ye may, the death blow of oppression in a better time and way. The dawn of old John Brown has brightened in the day, and his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, for his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. For his soul is marching on. For his soul